Welcome to Eternal Diary. I've been sitting with this script all week, and the image I keep returning to is a woman signing herself out of a trust in front of the people who want her gone, calmly, without hesitation, with her family watching. They've mistaken her stillness for defeat. This one is about building what they can't reach. You're watching Eternal Diary. The smell that came back first was paper. Old paper. The kind that's been in a drawer for 20 years. Slightly sweet, faintly chemical. My mother's solicitor's office had smelled exactly like that, and it was the last place I'd been before everything unraveled. When I opened my eyes, I was in my bedroom at Aldercroft House. Not my apartment in the city, not the one-room studio I'd ended up in afterward. The house, my childhood bedroom, with the yellow wallpaper I'd always hated, and the window that faced the garden and let in too much morning light. I lay still for a moment and let my mind catch up to my body. I was 31. No, I was 28 again. I could feel it, the particular weight of being 28, the way everything still felt provisional, not yet permanent. The last time I'd been 28, I had spent the year preparing for a wedding that never happened, and by the time I was 31, I had lost my father, my family home, every asset I'd believed was mine, and a man I had trusted completely. By 35, I had built something new. Something small but solid, purchased with my own labor, in my own name, debt-free. By 42, I had died. A car accident on a wet road, early March. Nothing dramatic about it. I had been thinking about a client meeting and whether I'd left my phone charger at the hotel, and then I hadn't been thinking anything at all. And now I was 28 again, in the yellow bedroom, and I could hear my father's voice somewhere downstairs. And I understood exactly what I was holding. I did not cry. I did not allow myself the luxury of a reaction. I stared at the water stain on the ceiling that I had spent years looking at as a teenager, and I made a list. Not a mental list, an actual list. I got up and found paper in my old desk drawer. There was always paper in the drawer. I had been a note-taking child. And I wrote down everything I knew. The Aldercroft Family Trust had been established by my grandfather in 1967. My father, Edmund, had been the primary beneficiary during his lifetime. My half-sister Arabella and I had been named as remainder beneficiaries in equal shares, with the trust to dissolve and distribute its assets upon the death of the last surviving sibling. That had been the plan. Once. When my father became ill, things shifted. Arabella, who shared a mother with no one, who had arrived into our household when I was 9 with the quiet confidence of someone who had been told she deserved things, began to move. Quietly at first, then with more purpose. By the time my father signed the amendment removing me from the trust, he had been medicated for pain for 4 months, and his handwriting no longer looked like his own. I had not known, the first time, that there were other trusts. I had not known because no one told me, and because grief had not left me with the presence of mind to ask. I had accepted the settlement, a single payment, insultingly modest, framed as a distribution, and I had signed the discharge form, and walked out of the family solicitor's office and gone home and sat on my kitchen floor for 2 hours without moving. This time, I was going to start making phone calls. My mother, Eleanor, had died when I was 14. She had been a quiet woman with organized drawers and opinions she rarely stated, and a habit of pressing flowers into books. She had grown up in the Wyndham family, a family with money that was older and less visible than my father's, and she had kept her family's affairs entirely separate from the Aldercroft household for reasons that, as a child, I had not understood. As an adult, as the adult I was, carrying 42 years of experience in a 28-year-old body, I understood perfectly. My mother had not trusted my father's second wife. She had not trusted the direction her marriage was heading. She had made arrangements accordingly. Her solicitor's name was Margaret Ellsworth, and I had met her exactly once, at the reading of my mother's small personal will when I was 14. Margaret had been in her 50s then, precise and undemonstrative, with a way of speaking that suggested she measured every word before releasing it. I had been too young and too devastated to ask her anything useful. I was going to ask her things now. I wrote Margaret's name at the top of the list and circled it twice. Below it, I wrote, Wyndham Trust. Find the paperwork. Below that, Fosgate Property Holdings. Check the trust register. Below that, New Vehicle. Sablecroft. I folded the paper once and put it in my coat pocket. which was hanging on the back of the door, and I went downstairs to have breakfast with my father, because I had exactly 8 months before he died, and I intended to use every one of them. My father was at the kitchen table with a newspaper, which was a habit so fixed it could have been a fixture of the room. He had aged since I last saw him this clearly, but of course he hadn't. Not yet, because I was remembering him from the end, and this was the beginning of the end, not the end itself. He was 63 and still strong, still himself, with the heavy hands and the reading glasses on a cord around his neck that he always said he was going to lose. "You're up early," he said without looking up. "Couldn't sleep." He turned the page. "Your sister's arriving Thursday." Half-sister, I thought. Your other daughter who does not love you any more than she loves the estate she intends to inherit, and who has been having conversations with the family solicitor that you don't know about. "I know," I said, and poured myself coffee. I had learned by 42 that most of what people call betrayal is simply the result of paying insufficient attention. My father had not been a careless man. He had been a busy one, and busy people delegate their trust, and delegation is a gap that other people fill. I was not going to pay insufficient attention this time. Margaret's office was in the city, in a building that had been a Victorian townhouse once, and was now a converted set of legal offices with a reception area that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and 2 low leather chairs. I knew this because I had been there, finally, at 36, when I was trying to recover something from the wreckage and had gone looking for the pieces of my mother's estate. I had found Margaret, still practicing, slower then, but precise as ever, and she had shown me what my mother had left behind. By that point, it had been too late to do much with it. This time, I arrived 11 years earlier, and the building still smelled like carpet cleaner, and Margaret was only 63 and sharp as a new pencil. "Vivian Aldercroft," she said when her assistant showed me in. She looked at me with a slight narrowing that was not unfriendly. "I wondered when you might come." That was interesting. "Did you?" "Your mother left instructions that you were to be told about her arrangements when you reached 30, but she also said that if you ever came before that, I was to tell you everything immediately." She straightened a pen on her desk. "She seemed to know there might be circumstances. She was a precise woman, your mother." My throat tightened. I had not expected to feel it so sharply. The shape of my mother, the structure of her mind, the way she had planned for contingencies. She had known. Not what would happen, but that something might. "Tell me everything," I said. The Wyndham Discretionary Trust had been created by my maternal grandfather in 1952. My grandmother had been the primary beneficiary during her lifetime. When my grandmother died, the trust did not dissolve. It had been structured as a perpetual discretionary trust, with a class of beneficiaries defined as all lineal descendants of my grandfather who were not the subject of a court-ordered financial restriction and who had not renounced their interest in writing. My mother had been a beneficiary. When my mother died, her interest did not automatically transfer to me. Discretionary trusts don't work like that. The trustees have discretion over distribution. But I remained, as my mother's child, a member of the beneficiary class. No one had told me this. The trustees of the Wyndham Trust were an independent trust company, Meridian Trust Services, who had been administering the vehicle quietly for decades. The fund held shares, property, and a portfolio of bonds. The current net value, Margaret said, with the particular care of someone delivering large numbers, was approximately £4.3 million. I sat very still. "Has anyone applied for distributions on my behalf?" I asked. "No, you've never been in contact with the trustees." "Can I contact them now? As a beneficiary? Do I have a right to information?" Margaret folded her hands. "You have a right to request information about the fund and to make a case for distribution. The trustees have discretion. They are not obligated to distribute to you, but they are obligated to consider your request in good faith and to weigh your circumstances." "What circumstances would they find compelling?" She almost smiled. "Need, generally, and the fact that you are the sole surviving descendant of the principal beneficiary line." I was the only child of my mother, who had been an only child. I was, as far as lineal descendants went, the end of the line. "I'd like to write to the trustees," I said. "Today, if possible." She reached into a drawer and produced a folder. It was labeled with my name, and it was thick. She had been waiting for me. The letter I drafted that afternoon, with Margaret's assistance, was careful and specific. It named my status as a lineal descendant. It provided my identification. It noted that I was currently employed as an associate at an architectural firm. True, in this timeline, I had been working there for 3 years, and that I was not under any court order or financial restriction. It expressed my wish to be formally recognized as an active member of the beneficiary class and to receive distributions at the trustee's discretion. I signed it. Margaret countersigned as a witness. The letter went out by registered post that evening. That was the second trust. The third was older, and I had found it by accident in my first life, 3 years after the fact, when it was too late to do anything with it. My father had been in business for 30 years before he became ill. In the early years of his career, he had been a partner in a property development company with a man named Godfrey Fosgate. And when that company wound down in the early 90s, the assets had been divided. Most went to Godfrey. Some went into a trust structure called the Fosgate Property Trust, which had been set up as a vehicle for jointly held assets and had specific provisions about the management and succession of those assets. The Fosgate Property Trust included a clause. I had seen it, eventually, too late, that named the children of the founding partners as secondary beneficiaries in the event that both founding partners died without having received their full share of the trust's capital. My father had died with a portion of his capital share uncollected. He had never bothered to claim it. The amount had seemed modest. He had been occupied with other things. His uncollected share had passed to his children, to Arabella, and to me. Except that by the time my father died, I had signed a discharge releasing all interests in the Aldercroft Trust, without realizing there was a second legal entity I also had a claim against. The discharge was specific to the Aldercroft Trust, but no one had told me about the Fosgate vehicle, and so I had not known to preserve my rights in it separately. This time, I knew. The Fosgate Trust was administered by a firm called Pendleton and Associates. And 2 weeks after I went to see Margaret, I called their office and asked to speak with whoever managed the Fosgate Property Trust. There was a pause that I recognized as the pause of someone trying to remember what that trust was. "I'm Vivian Aldercroft," I said. "My father is Edmund Aldercroft. I believe I'm a named secondary beneficiary. I'd like to verify my status." Another pause. Longer this time. The sound of someone opening something on a computer. "Could you hold, please?" I held. The trust administrator, when she came back, was cautious and precise. She confirmed that a Fosgate Property Trust existed. She confirmed that Edmund Aldercroft had been a founding partner. She said she would need to verify my identity before she could confirm beneficiary status, or provide any information about the trust's current holdings. I sent the verification documents that afternoon. The response came within the week. I was confirmed as a secondary beneficiary. The trust held 3 commercial properties in the city. Modest, not spectacular, but income-generating, and my entitlement, in the event of my father's death with uncollected capital, would be calculated at that time. The calculations, once I ran them with Crispin, a trust and estate solicitor I had found through a referral from Margaret, young and methodical and very good at reading instruments other people had found boring, came to somewhere between $900,000 and $1.2 million, depending on property valuations at the relevant date. I thanked Crispin and told him to flag any correspondence from Pendleton and Associates and to make a note of the date. That was the third trust. The fourth was mine. I built it from scratch. A Sablecroft Discretionary Trust, named for nothing in particular, registered in my name as the settlor, and administered by an independent trustee company I selected because they had a reputation for discretion and competence and were not connected to my family in any way. The funding was the puzzle. I was 28 and earning a reasonable salary, but I was not wealthy. Not yet, not in my own right. What I had was knowledge, and what knowledge gave me was a head start. My mother had died without a substantial estate in the ordinary sense, but she had had a custodial investment account that I had seen referenced once, briefly, in a document Margaret had shown me in that later visit. The account had been transferred upon my mother's death to a holding entity, a small company my mother had registered years earlier, quietly, in her own name. The company had not been dissolved. It had been sitting, dormant, in the company's house register, with its shares owned by my mother's estate, and its estate administered by an executor who had never finalized the estate because no one had chased him to do so. The executor, a man named Silvano, who had been my mother's accountant and was still practicing, was startled to receive a letter from Crispin asking to discuss the outstanding estate matter. He admitted on the phone, assumed the family had elected not to pursue it. He apologized for not having followed up. He sounded genuinely contrite, which I found both useful and irrelevant. The holding company's assets, once the estate was finalized, transferred to me as my mother's sole heir. The assets included the custodial investment account, now worth somewhat more than when my mother had last touched it, because the investments had continued to compound quietly for 14 years, and the holding company's interest in a small block of 4 residential units in the east of the city, which my mother had purchased in the early 90s, and which had been generating rental income that pooled back into the account. The residential block was worth, at current valuations, just over £1.8 million. I transferred both assets into the Sablecroft Trust within 6 weeks of recovering them. I then called Crispin and asked him to draft the trust instrument with specific provisions about my own entitlement and the entitlement of any future beneficiaries I might name. I read the draft twice and corrected 2 clauses that were too loose. Crispin looked mildly impressed and did not say so, which I respected. By the time Arabella arrived for her 3rd visit that autumn, looking polished and purposeful, and directing her attention at everything in the house as if she were already cataloging it, I had secured my position in 3 separate trusts and built a 4th. The Aldercroft Family Trust, in its amended form, could be taken from me. I was prepared to let it go. I want to be clear about something. I did not enjoy this period. It is a mistake to imagine that knowing the outcome removes the weight of living through the process. My father was ill, and watching him decline a 2nd time was not easier for having watched it once. He was my father. I loved him with the specific, complicated love that exists between parents and children who do not entirely understand each other, and his diminishment was painful, regardless of what I knew. I did not harden myself. I simply did not allow my grief to make me inattentive. Every Sunday, I drove to Aldercroft House and had lunch with my father. And every Sunday, I listened to what he said and noticed what he didn't say. And after lunch, I sat in the garden with him while he read, and sometimes we didn't speak at all, and that was fine. Arabella came to several of those lunches. She was always perfectly pleasant to me and always slightly too attentive to our father, the kind of attentive that wants to be noticed. She brought gifts, she asked questions about the house, she referred in passing, and with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed it, to the complexity of managing the estate, to how much there was to organize, to how much our father must have on his mind. My father looked at her with an expression I had learned to read over 2 lifetimes. Fond, distracted, faintly grateful, not entirely listening. He had always found Arabella decorative. He had never found her sharp. He had underestimated both of us, in different directions for different reasons. "You seem very calm these days," Arabella said to me one Sunday in late October, when our father had gone inside to rest and we were alone in the garden. "Do I?" "You do." She turned her glass in her hands. She had brought a bottle of wine. "It suits you." I looked at the garden, the rose bed that needed cutting back, the old wall with the espaliered pear tree that had been there since my grandfather's time, and I said nothing. "I've been thinking about the estate," she said. "I'm sure you have." A small silence. She had expected more resistance, or more compliance, something she could get purchase on. My neutrality was, I knew, difficult for her. Arabella operated by reading reactions and adjusting accordingly, and I was not giving her a reaction. "Dad's not going to live forever," she said, and her voice was gentle, which was how she was dangerous. "It would be practical to think about structures." "I agree." She looked at me. "You do?" "Yes." I met her eyes. They were very blue, my half-sister's eyes, and very clear, and I knew, looking at them, that she was calculating. She had been calculating since she was a child. I think everyone with an interest in an estate should understand its structures clearly. I stood up. "Are you staying for dinner?" She said she was. I went inside and thought, let her calculate. Adrian came into the picture the following month. In my first life, Adrian had been my fiancé for 2 years, and my grief's companion for none. He was a partner at my father's investment firm, and he was the kind of man who looked excellent at a distance and grew less excellent the closer you got. He was charming, he was not kind. There is a difference, and I had spent my first life confusing the two. I had been 26 when we got together, and 28 when I discovered that a significant portion of his charm was directed simultaneously at my half-sister. I had not known this the first time. I had known only that after my father died and I lost everything, Adrian had retreated. Professionally occupied, he said. Too busy, he was sorry, and had stopped returning my calls within 3 months. I had discovered the rest of it 4 years later, when I ran into him at an industry event and saw him arrive with Arabella on his arm. By then it had ceased to matter. But the particular ugliness of it, the specific texture of that specific betrayal, had never quite left. Now, watching him walk into the sitting room at Aldercroft House with that well-rehearsed ease, I felt something that was not grief and not anger, but was adjacent to both. "Vivian," he said, with the particular warmth of a man who believes warmth is a resource he controls. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I'm often here," I said. He sat down across from me and asked me questions about my work with the attentive focus of a man who is performing attentiveness, and I answered them. I did not perform anything. I was simply a woman sitting in a chair having a conversation, and if something in my composure put him slightly off balance, I made no effort to correct it. He asked me at the end of the visit if I'd like to have dinner sometime. "No, thank you," I said. He looked surprised. He was accustomed, I knew, to being pursued by the women he withdrew from. My refusal was not what he had anticipated. "I'm fairly busy," I added pleasantly, which was true. He left, and I watched my father watch him go. And my father said, "I always liked Adrian." And I said, "I know you do." And that was the entirety of what I said on that subject. My father declined through winter with a slowness that made it feel, sometimes, like it might not be happening, and then with a suddenness in early spring that confirmed that it always had been. By March, he was in hospital. By April, he was home with a care team. By May, he was sleeping most of the day. I visited every second day. I sat with him. I read to him, when he was awake enough to want it. I held his hand, which had been large and strong, and was now thin-skinned and light. Arabella visited twice a week, and always made sure someone saw her arrive. I noticed that the family solicitor, a man named Barnett who had a manner I had always found professionally sycophantic, was attending the house at increasing intervals. I noticed that Arabella was often present at these visits. I noticed that my father, in those weeks, signed several documents that I was not shown. I knew what the documents were. I had seen the results in another life. I did not intervene. I did not confront Barnett. I did not challenge Arabella. I had a meeting with Crispin instead, and I asked him to confirm, one more time, that the 3 external trusts were properly documented, that my beneficiary status in the Wyndham Trust had been formally acknowledged by the trustees, that the Fosgate position was confirmed and on record, that the Sablecroft Trust was properly constituted and funded. He confirmed all of it. The Wyndham trustees had responded formally. I was on record as an active member of the beneficiary class. The Fosgate administrators had confirmed my secondary beneficiary status and noted my father's uncollected capital share in their records. The Sablecroft instrument was properly drawn, the assets properly transferred, the trustee company properly appointed. "Is there anything else?" Crispin asked. "One thing," I said. "If I sign a discharge releasing my interests in one trust, does that affect my interest in any other?" He looked at me with the particular attention of a solicitor who has realized a client knows more than they are saying. "Not if the discharge is specific to the trust named in the document, which it would be if properly drawn." "And if it is improperly drawn? If, for example, the language is broader than it needs to be?" A pause. "Then you'd want to read it very carefully before you signed." "Yes," I said. "I thought so." My father died on the 14th of June. He went quietly, in the morning, in his own bedroom with the old curtains that had been in that room since I was born. I was there. Arabella arrived 20 minutes later. We did not speak in the car on the way to the funeral. We did not speak much at the funeral. We stood at opposite ends of the room at the reception afterward, and she circled and I stood. And people who knew us both looked between us with the uncertain social awareness of people who could sense something happening but could not name it. Adrian was at the reception. He found me near the window and stood close, and said something about loss and how he was there if I needed him. I thanked him and moved to speak with someone else. Barnett called me into his office 3 weeks after the funeral. I went alone. I had asked if I could bring my own solicitor, and Barnett had said there was really no need. This was a simple matter, just a family formality. I had said I understood and arrived alone, as requested. This was a departure from my first life. In my first life, I had not known to ask if I could bring someone. I had simply gone, and I had signed, and I had not read carefully enough. The office smelled of coffee and the particular staleness of rooms that are not opened enough. Barnett had the document on his desk when I arrived, a trust amendment instrument, and a separate form that I recognized as a beneficiary discharge. I picked up the discharge first. I read it slowly, line by line, which made Barnett shift in his chair. "It's fairly standard," he said. "I'm sure it is," I said, without looking up. The discharge was, as I had hoped and expected, specific to the Sablecroft family trust. It did not contain any broader release language. It did not purport to discharge me of interests in any other vehicle. Either Barnett was competent enough to have drawn it narrowly, or Arabella had not thought to instruct him to draw it broadly. More likely the latter. I read the amendment. I had been removed from the trust completely. Not reduced in share, removed. The remainder beneficiary was now solely Arabella. There was a provision for a distribution to me of £45,000, described in the document as a goodwill payment in recognition of prior beneficial interest. £45,000. In my first life, I had found that insulting and overwhelming in equal measure. I was 28, and I had no other resources, and $45,000 felt simultaneously like a rebuke and a lifeline. Now it was simply capital. I could put $45,000 into the Sablecroft Trust and let it compound. "I'll need a moment," I told Barnett. I sat with the document and thought about whether there was anything I had missed, anything in the amendment instrument that could create a backdating issue, anything in the discharge that could be interpreted more broadly than I wanted. I had read trust law thoroughly over the preceding months, with Crispin's guidance, and I found nothing I had not anticipated. I picked up the pen. I felt Barnett watching me. He was expecting something. Tears, perhaps, or anger, or some display of the emotional response that would allow him to take control of the room. He was that kind of man. He needed the other person to perform a feeling so he could manage it. I signed the discharge. I signed the acknowledgement of the amendment. I put the pen down. "Thank you," I said. "I assume the distribution will be processed in the normal timeline?" Yes, absolutely. 4 to 6 weeks. "Fine." I stood and collected my bag. "I'll have my solicitor's details sent over for correspondence." He looked mildly startled at the mention of my solicitor. He had assumed, I thought, that I had none, but said nothing. I left. In the car, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel and let myself feel what was there. Not nothing. I want to be accurate about this. There was grief in what I had just done, a particular grief for the version of my father who had loved me enough to include me once, and not enough to protect me in the end. There was grief for the family home that was no longer, in any official sense, going to pass to me. I let myself feel it. Then I started the car and drove. Arabella had dinner with Adrian that evening. I knew because Margaret, who had a friend on Arabella's street, mentioned it in passing. Whether this was intentional or casual, I couldn't say. What I knew was that they were celebrating, which meant someone had told Arabella the document was signed. Barnett, I thought. He had called her before I reached my car. I did not find this particularly interesting. They could have their dinner. The Wyndham Trust distributions began 7 weeks after I signed the Sablecroft discharge. The trustees had been considering my application for 3 months, and their process was exactly as Margaret had described. A formal review of my circumstances, a request for supporting documentation, a period of deliberation. I had provided the documents and waited. I had not pressured, not followed up more than once, not done anything that could be characterized as aggressive or unstable. What I had provided, carefully and quietly, was the picture of a woman who had recently been removed from her primary inheritance structure and who was, as a direct result, in a position of genuine need. That was not untrue. The £45,000 distribution from the Aldercroft Trust had arrived and been transferred into the Sablecroft vehicle. My salary was reasonable, but I was not wealthy. I had no other obvious resources. The Wyndham trustees distributed £1.2 million to me in 2 tranches, the first in August and the second in November. I paid the tax on both. I had been meticulous about the tax. Crispin had been meticulous about the tax. The second distribution went into a combination of vehicles, some into Sablecroft, some into an investment account in my own name, some into a pension instrument that Crispin recommended for long-term efficiency. The Fosgate Trust position crystallized the following spring. My father's uncollected capital share was calculated, final valuations were done on the 3 commercial properties, and a distribution was processed. The amount came to just over $1.1 million. I sat with the confirmation letter for a while. I thought about my father, who had never bothered to collect this share, who had considered it too small to attend to, who had been occupied with other things. It was not a small amount. It had simply never been visible to him, or visible enough to feel worth pursuing. I thought about all the things that are not visible to people who are too busy to look. The Sablecroft Trust, in the meantime, held the residential property block, the investment portfolio my mother had left, the £45,000 Aldercroft distribution, and, as I added to it in the following months, portions of my own savings. Crispin had helped me structure it with a professional trustee and an investment mandate that was clear and conservative. There was something very satisfying about the completeness of it. A structure that was entirely my own, funded by assets that had been inherited but never claimed, governed by an instrument I had read and corrected and understood fully. Nothing in it was provisional. Nothing depended on another person's good opinion of me. By the autumn of that second year, the total value of the 3 trusts in which I held confirmed positions, Wyndham, Fosgate, and Sablecroft, was somewhere in the region of £8.5 million. The Aldercroft Family Trust, in which I held no position, held assets valued at approximately £5 million. Arabella had won the smaller prize. I want to note that this is not a story about revenge. Not exactly. Revenge is a reaction. What I had done was not reactive. I had not moved against Arabella. I had not sued, had not challenged the trust amendment, though I knew a competent barrister could have made a credible case around the circumstances of my father's signing, the degree of his cognitive impairment, the timing of the amendment relative to the care team's records. I had decided very early that I did not want to spend years in litigation. I did not want to build my life on the instability of a legal challenge that might or might not succeed. What I wanted was solidity, something that could not be contested because there was nothing to contest, something that existed entirely outside the reach of anyone who wanted to move against me. I had that now. Adrian called me in October. The call was brief, and he was careful, as if he were testing how things stood. He said he'd been thinking about me. He hoped I was well. He said the last year had been a lot for everyone. I said it had. He said, after a pause, "Arabella mentioned you'd had some success recently." Had she? I kept my voice pleasant. She reads the property registers? A silence. I had let him understand that I knew he knew. "I was glad to hear it," he said, with the particular effort of a man walking across thin ice. "Thank you for saying so," I said, with the particular composure of a woman standing on solid ground. He said goodbye. I put the phone down, and that was, as far as I was concerned, the last relevant thing he had to say. There was a family solicitor meeting in November, the annual review of the Aldercroft Trust's administration, which I no longer had any right to attend. Arabella had told our father's housekeeper, who still managed the property and had a long and complex loyalty to the family, that the meeting was purely administrative, that all was well, that the estate was in good health. I was not at the meeting. I was in a restaurant on the other side of the city having dinner with Margaret, who had, over the past year, become something like a friend. in the particular way that older women with precise minds and a history of watching families dissolve sometimes become friends with younger women who have survived a version of what they've spent their careers witnessing. She ordered fish, and I ordered lamb, and we ate without discussing the meeting happening elsewhere, because there was nothing to discuss. The meeting was not about me. The estate was not mine. The decisions being made in that room were not decisions I had any stake in. I was free of it. Not with relief, I want to be accurate, but with the very particular sensation of a hand unclenched. The release of effort that had gone into holding something that kept trying to close around a fist. "You look well," Margaret said, which was as much as she ever said in that direction. "I am well," I said. We talked about a case she was handling, one of her other clients. Not by name, but by situation. A woman trying to recover what she hadn't known to protect. I listened and offered what I had, which was not legal advice, but something adjacent to it. The perspective of someone who had looked at these structures carefully and understood the gaps. "You should have been a solicitor," she said. "I thought about it," I said. "I might still." The lamb was good. The wine was better. Outside, the city went about its business, indifferent and immediate, and full of people who were holding things they didn't know how to protect. Arabella called me in December. This was unexpected. She had not called me in months, had communicated only through Barnett's office on administrative matters. She was pleasant. She asked how I was. She mentioned the holidays. She said she was thinking about selling Aldecroft House, which she now owned outright as the trust's remainder beneficiary, and she wanted to let me know as a courtesy. "That's kind of you," I said. "I just thought you should hear it from me." "I appreciate that." A pause. She was waiting for something. The something, I understood, was an acknowledgement of her power. She was the one who owned the house, who could sell it, who held the name. She wanted to see if that landed. "It's a good time to sell," I said. "The market's been steady. You should get a fair price." Another pause. This one had a different quality. "You're not upset," she said, and it came out less smoothly than she had intended. "About the house?" I considered. I have complicated feelings about the house. But no, not upset. About any of it. I thought about this honestly, because she was asking something real, and there was, under her careful surface, something that might have been discomfort. "I made my peace with it," I said, which was true in the most technical sense. She said goodbye. I put the phone down and sat for a moment. I did not feel triumphant, which I thought might surprise people. What I felt was more like the conclusion of a long accounting, the settling of figures that had been outstanding for too long, a balance confirmed. The Aldecroft house sold the following March. The sale proceeds went to Arabella. She was, I understood through the passive intelligence of mutual connections, also now formally involved with Adrian, who was involved with the investment firm that had several overlapping interests with the Aldecroft estate. I took a moment to note the neatness of their arrangement. They had, between them, the asset that everyone had been looking at. They had not been looking at what I had. In April, I sat at a table in Crispin's office and reviewed the current status of all 4 vehicles. He walked me through the figures, the trust assets, the income generated, the distributions received, the forward projections based on current valuations and reasonable growth assumptions. The total across all vehicles was over 9 million. I was 30 years old. I had not married. I had not relied on anyone. I had not won anything that had been taken from me. The Aldecroft Trust was gone, and I had let it go. What I held was entirely separate from that loss, had been built alongside it and in anticipation of it, and could not be contested by anyone who had participated in that taking. "Is there anything you want to change in the structures?" Crispin asked. I looked at the papers on the table, at the instruments I could recite by heart, at the beneficiary designations and the trustee appointments and the investment mandates that I had read and corrected and understood. "Not yet," I said. I had been thinking about what to do next. The city I had stayed in for convenience had begun to feel like a choice that needed revisiting. There was a commission I had been offered in another city, an architectural project I had not been in a position to accept the first time around. Something large and interesting, and mine, entirely, from the first conversation. The Sablecroft Trust was structured to be portable. The Wyndham and Fosgate positions were managed by independent trustees. They required nothing from me geographically. My financial position did not depend on any particular place. I gave notice at my current firm on a Thursday, professionally and with appropriate notice, and I went home that evening and sat in the apartment I had moved into 18 months ago, and I thought about what my mother had been like at 30. She had been, by 30, already the woman she would remain. Organized, quiet, precise, operating within structures she had built or rebuilt to her own specifications. She had been an architect of her own circumstances, even in the years when circumstances resisted architecture. I thought I understood her better now than I had at any previous point. I packed over 2 weekends with nothing dramatic about it. I sold some furniture and moved the rest into storage. I arranged for the residential block's management to be handled by an agency. I updated my address with the Wyndham trustees and the Fosgate administrators, and Crispin's office. On the morning I left, I drove past Aldercroft House, which had a sold sign at the gate. I looked at the yellow stone and the old wall and the espaliered pear tree, which I could see from the road. I had grown up in that house. I had learned things in that house that had taken the rest of my life, the first one to understand. My mother had lived in that house and quietly prepared for the possibility that she might not always be there to protect what she had. I drove past it without stopping. The city fell away behind me, and I thought about the list I had written on that first morning in the yellow bedroom. Margaret's name at the top, circled twice, and below it the names of 3 trusts and a 4th I hadn't built yet. The list was complete. The work had been done. I turned onto the motorway and thought about the commission, and what I was going to make of it, and what it would take to make it well. I did not look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there I needed to see.